Welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening for the virtual book launch of Seth Klein's new book, A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. We have had 250 people who registered for the virtual book launch this evening. So thanks everyone for joining us. We think you are in for a very inspiring and informative evening, well, at least an hour and a half of your time this evening anyway. My name is Christine Saulnier, and I'm the director of the Nova Scotia office of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. My organization, the CCPA, is one of many organizations that have come together to co-sponsor tonight's event. Our other co-sponsors are ECW Press, that's the book's publisher, the Corporate Mapping Project, the David Suzuki Foundation, 350.org Canada, Climate Action Network Canada, the Council of Canadians, Black River Wind, the Ecology Action Centre, the ENRICH Project, Halifax-Dartmouth and District Labour Council, and School Strike for Halifax. Thanks to them all for being partners on this event. If you want to get involved or support any of tonight's co-sponsors, please visit their websites. We will be putting those into the chat for you with the links. As you can see, there's lots of excitement about Seth's new book, which has been called, quote, the blueprint for rapid societal transformation that we've all been waiting for, says science journalist Zia Tong. It's exactly what we need right now, says former clerk of the Privy Council, Alex Himmelfarb. It's a Canadian climate emergency manifesto that brings it all together, says former MP Libby Davies. It's exactly the book we need right now, says anti-poverty activist Paul M. Taylor. Read this inspiring book, says David Suzuki, and this is the roadmap out of the climate crisis that Canadians have been waiting for, says author Naomi Klein, although that one, little suspect, given that's Seth's sister, she might be a little biased. We hope that you will find out more about the book. If you haven't read it already, you have a chance to ask questions of Seth, but we will put links in the chat for you to find out more and where you can buy the book as well. Our plan for tonight is as follows. I will be your moderator and your host for the evening. In a moment, Elder Dorian Bernard will be offering an Indigenous welcome. Then we are going to have a musical contribution from Joel Plaskett. Seth will then share a bit from the book for 15 minutes, and then he and I will have some Q&A. Then we will ask Dorene and two other local panelists about what the next stage of climate mobilization needs to look like in our province. And you'll have a chance again to ask questions of the panelists and of Seth. And then we will wish you all a good night. By the way, as you're watching, you are welcome to read more about the book at sethklein.ca. The book is absolutely available now in print, as an ebook, as an audiobook, and we urge you to order it. And of course, we encourage you to purchase from your favorite local bookstore. Now, on with the show. First off, please join me in welcoming Mi'kmaq Elder Dorene Bernard of the Shubenacadie Band, who will be providing us with a welcome.
Welcome, Jalasi. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are on the unceded ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq. This territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship, which were signed by the Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqiyik people with the British Crown in the 1700s. The treaties did not deal with surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqiyik title and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. We have peace and friendship treaties with the Crown that protects our Indigenous rights and title to our lands and waters in Mi'kma'ki, pre-Confederation treaty rights that are entrenched in the Canadian Constitution. Thank you.
Well, and Dorene. I know that you have spent the last week in Saulnierville.
Yes.
And as a Saulnier, I want to acknowledge that my father's family comes from the town, from that area of the province, and that I am ashamed as an Acadian that the Acadian flag is flying, being used in the violent actions against the Indigenous people who are exercising their treaty rights. And as Seth says in the book, if we have any hope of addressing the climate emergency, our hope lies with Indigenous people and their guardianship of our resources, and I have every confidence in that. We do have a link that we will share in the chat that gives more information on how you can support the Mi'kmaq asserting their treaty rights to fish for a modest livelihood.
Thank you.
It's now my pleasure to share Joel Plaskett's musical opening, which he wrote for this event. In addition to writing some of our favorite music, Joel has been very supportive of the climate movement in Nova Scotia, and he pre-recorded this song just for us.
Hi, everybody. Nice to be invited to be part of this event. Seth, thanks for the invitation. Congratulations on the book. It's a really important and timely book you've written. I'm going to sing a song I wrote just a couple days ago. I thought maybe it would be one to try a new song. Here is part of it. It's called Where There's a Will, because I can't help but think that maybe some of the answers to this climate emergency are simpler than we think. Maybe they're hugely complex as well. But regardless, we got to hop to it. There's a will, and I read it. Here's what it says. It says the earth is our inheritance, not just for you and for me, for the birds in the sky, for the fish in the sea, and the sweet by and by. Now we could sit in the field where these trees used to sway, and I could tell you how Rome wasn't built in a day. But then time's getting tight, and I hear you say, where there's a will, there's a way. There's a will, there's a way, there's a path in the dark, where only the stars seem to know where you are. Find the love for the ones who won't hear what you say. Where there's a will, there's a way. Well, there's a will, and it's written on the petals of the flowers, singing this land is your land, but this song is ours. And if they bend a few notes and they fall out of tune, don't lose faith in the choir, or no one's immune. We might be misled and we might sound naive, but this much is true, this much I believe. When you're lost for words, don't know what to say, there's a way. it to be. I sound just like my father. If we all sound like someone, then why do we bother? We know it ain't easy, but it's not a cliche. Where there's a will, where there's a will, there's a way, there's a path in the dark, where only the stars seem to know where they are. Find the love for the ones who would lead you astray. Where there's a will, there is still a way. See everybody, thanks for letting me be a part of this. Congratulations, Seth.
Thank you so much, Joel. That was fantastic. Indeed, it is political will that has been lacking in tackling the climate emergency. Our movement is strengthened by music and art, and we are so happy you could provide it for us tonight, Joel. We have included a link in the chat where you can find out more about Joel's music. Now, Sherry Yano, David Suzuki Foundation's Manager of Renewable Energy Transition, will introduce Seth Klein. Over to you, Sherry.
Thanks, Christine. Hi, everyone. I'm joining you all from the West Coast, where it's still daylight out, from the unceded ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And at the David Suzuki Foundation, a big part of our climate team works on a program called Charged Up that's all about engaging and enabling people in communities across Canada to act on the climate crisis. And so, as you can imagine, we are huge fans of Seth's book, not just our program, but the entire organization. So probably like many of you, we are always trying to earn the right to collaborate with different groups and leaders to move the dial together to take action and ensure that meaningful climate policies, regulations, and programs are put in place that help shift our system. And as Seth points out, in A Good War, there's a place for everyone in the climate movement, and it's so true. It takes all of us to mobilize resources and people and take action at the scale needed. And so I think we're super lucky when we have a moment like tonight where we can hear a diverse range of voices calling for ambitious and essential change. It's heartening, and that's definitely one of the reasons I'm looking forward to the panel discussion tonight, and so grateful for everyone for taking the time out of your day to join us this evening and to participate too in the chat. I can see some comments coming in. One thing we've learned through our Charged Up program, there are a whole lot of ordinary people, just regular folks out there doing extraordinary things in terms of climate action as individuals, as families, as neighborhoods and communities, and no doubt like many of you. And another thing I've noticed, or we've noticed really in our program, is how important it is to come together like this with amazing musicians. That song, like just that there is a way forward and it is collective will, that was so beautiful. But musicians, thinkers, authors, activists, all of you, because it's so easy to get disheartened and to feel isolated in our own worries and concerns, but it's so great when we get to be with others who care about action on the climate crisis and on the crippling racism, colonization, and inequity that continues to stand in the way of that better future that we all long for. So we are in this together, and these are really the moments that nourish us. And so I guess I should get on with things. I have the great honor to introduce the person of the evening, the guy we all came to hear. So Seth Klein was the founding BC director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives for over 2 decades, and has taken action to address climate change and inequality since he was in high school, or maybe even earlier, I'm not sure. He's currently an adjunct professor at Simon Fraser University and remains a research associate with the CCPA. I had the good fortune to travel to a workshop with Seth about a year ago, so before COVID, and I remember that we talked about his book a lot of the way there, and it was super inspiring for me to hear all the thought and the many conversations and the huge amount of research that he poured into a good war. So huge congratulations, Seth, for putting this wonderful book out into the world. And with that, over to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Sherry, for that lovely introduction. And thank you all so much for attending. You know, it's of course disappointing not to be doing this in person. I had really wanted to come out there to Halifax for this, but it's thrilling to know that you're all here tonight. I see about 100 of you out there. This is my first book, and so putting it out in the world is of course nerve-wracking, but I'm grateful to feel your enthusiasm over the ether there. If I may, I just want to start with some thank yous. First, I too want to acknowledge and express my gratitude that while you are all over your province on the lands of many Indigenous nations, I am on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations here in Vancouver. Thank you, Dorene, for that lovely welcome. And, you know, I realize land acknowledgements for a virtual event may feel a little odd, but as Christine said, and I argue in the book, the recognition and assertion of Indigenous rights and title is central to winning this existential fight. And the chapter on Indigenous leadership in the climate mobilization in the book is actually one of my favorites. Second, I want to thank all the organizations that have co-sponsored tonight's event. I'm not going to name you all again, but please do go to the chat and check people out. But I do want to say a special thank you to my former colleagues at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, which was my longtime home, for taking on being the lead host for this event. The CCPA folks are really the people with whom so many of the ideas in my book were developed, and they've been so supportive of this effort, and I'm deeply grateful to them. And third, thank you so much to Joel Plaskett for that gorgeous and moving musical opener. It really is something. I was keen to open with music like that, and not just because it's a good way to start an event, you know, touching our hearts as well as our heads, but also because it was my hope that we could profile some climate emergency music. One of the chapters in the book deals with how to rally the public, and like every chapter, it starts with lessons from the Second World War. And in the war, arts and entertainment played a crucial role in mobilizing the public. World War II had a popular soundtrack. The climate emergency moment, not yet. But our hope with all of these musical openers on this virtual book tour is to start to seed what that soundtrack might be. And so thank you, Joel, for kicking us off, and with an original song, no less. I don't know what to say. And finally, my thanks to the organizations who provided me with funding to undertake this book project: the McConnell Foundation, the Medcalf Foundation, the Corporate Mapping Project, the David Suzuki Foundation, the BC Teachers Federation, and Simon Fraser University's Urban Studies program. Okay, with that done, I'm going to offer some opening comments about the book. I hope and think that the book makes an important contribution to this moment, and that it calls on us to adopt an entirely new and different approach to the climate crisis than the one that we've pursued to date. And while I've endeavored to tell the truth about the severity of the crisis we face, I also hope and believe that you will find it an unusually hopeful book. As the title suggests, I'm convinced that to confront the climate emergency, a wartime approach is needed. And moreover, that our wartime experience should be embraced as a hopeful story. Now, there's no small irony to me coming to this place. And like many of you, I'm sure, I too wrestle with this war analogy. I cut my political teeth as a teenager in the peace movement. I am the child of Vietnam War resistors. That's in fact how I happen to be Canadian. But I am now strongly of the view that the climate breakdown requires a new mindset to mobilize all of society and to galvanize our politics and to fundamentally remake our economy. And I want to show you why. So I'm going to ask Emma to, oh yeah, there it is, great. You know, it's a CCPA sponsored event, so you know there's got to be a chart, right? So what I'm trying to show with this chart is that despite decades of calls to action, our greenhouse gas emissions are not on a path to stave off a horrific future for our children and future generations. The chart tracks Canada's greenhouse gas emissions going back to the year 2000, and what is evident is that in the face of the defining challenge of our time, our politics have not been rising to the task at hand. And I want to just invite us to let this deeply disturbing chart sink in, and then let us all agree that what we have been doing is simply not working. we have run out the clock with these distracting debates about incremental changes, but where it matters most, actual GHG emissions, we have accomplished precious little. Now, you might look at a chart like this and say, well, at least things have flatlined. You know, our emissions aren't going up anymore. But as the great climate change warrior and founder of 350.org, Bill McKibben, has said, winning slowly on climate is just another way of losing. Politics might be all about compromise and the art of the possible, but there is no bargaining with the laws of nature, and nature is now telling us something fierce. I gather it's been telling you folks in Nova Scotia something fierce this last day, and last week it was telling us something fierce here in Vancouver, where for a week we did not see the sun. We were enveloped in smoke from the fires in Western California, and just as we were sending our children back to school and told that the windows would stay open and the kids would be outside as much as possible, we were ordered to stay inside and shut our windows. This is the convergence of the crises we face. And so a new approach is needed. We need a wartime mindset and a political and policy agenda to tackle the climate emergency. And that's why I believe it's time for a good war. So I'm going to keep my opening short, but I want to just give you a sense of the book. The book project began as an exploration for how we can align our politics and economy in Canada with what the science says we must urgently do. And it is that. I'd always planned to include a chapter on lessons from the Second World War for rapid transformation. But as I delved into that work, I began to see more and more parallels between our wartime experience and the current crisis, and ultimately decided to structure the entire book around lessons from Canada's Second World War experience. Not because I get all weirdly animated about war. Rather, it is because I see in the history of our wartime experience this helpful and in fact hopeful reminder that we have done this before. We have mobilized in common cause across society to confront an existential threat. And in doing so, we have retooled our entire economy, not once, but twice. Once to ramp up military production, another time to reconvert to peacetime in the space of 6 short years. So the book explores what that wartime scale climate mobilization could actually mean and look like. Each chapter jumps back and forth in time between stories of what Canada did in the war and what we now face. And in the comparisons, it's trying to answer questions like, how has public opinion rallied to support mobilization during the war? How can it be galvanized again? What was the role of government, the news media, arts and culture? How was social solidarity secured across class and race and gender? And can we do that again? How is national unity established across Canada's many provinces with their varying interests? And can we successfully achieve that again as we move off fossil fuels? How did we collectively transform our economy and marshal all of our resources to produce what was needed? And how can we do that again? How did we pay for that transformation? And can we mobilize the finances once again? What supports were offered for returning soldiers? And is there a model there for just transition for fossil fuel workers today? What was the role of Indigenous people in the war? And what is it in today's transformation? What was the role of youth and social movements then and now? Importantly, what are the war's cautionary tales, the warnings of things that brought us shame, the internments, the squashing of civil rights, the response to refugees that we don't want to repeat? And critically, what sort of political leadership do we require to see us through challenges like this? And I'll share one important comparison that I make near the beginning of the book because it gives me some hope. And it's this, which is that despite Canada's war declaration in September of 1939, it's worth recalling that even as the winds of war gathered in the late 1930s, our leaders were reluctant to recognize what would ultimately be necessary, a lot like today. Canada was on the cusp of being completely transformed by its Second World War experience. Yet right up to the 11th hour, our government still hoped to avoid getting dragged into that fight. And that's where we find ourselves today in this awkward period where, last summer, Justin Trudeau's government passed a climate emergency motion in the House of Commons one day, and the very next day reapproves the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. That is the new climate denialism at play, a concept I unpack in the book. But as with the Second World War, this phony war will not last, and I'm convinced it's about to end. The book is an invitation to our political leaders to reflect on the leaders who saw us through the Second World War and to consider who they want to be and how they want to be remembered as we undertake this defining task of our lives. And my hope is that the book might embolden them to be more politically daring than we've seen to date, because that's what this moment demands. And much like the trials that tested the character of past generations, the book is also an invitation to all of us to reflect on who we want to be as we together confront this crisis. In the first chapter, just to give you a teaser, I share what I see as some of the key lessons from the Second World War, which I dubbed the battle plan for climate mobilization. It's a 14-point plan outlining what does it look like to adopt an emergency mindset and do what it takes to win. Much of the book deals with connections between climate action and inequality and argues for why linking these crises is central to winning. And I'll conclude my opening comments with this. Like many of you, as I read the latest scientific warnings, I'm afraid. In particular, I feel deep anxiety about the state of the world that we are leaving our kids and those who will live throughout most of this century and beyond. All of us who take seriously these scientific realities wrestle with despair. That is the ambiguous time in which we live. The truth is, we don't know if we're going to win this fight, if we're going to do what we need to do in time. But it is worth appreciating that those who rallied in the face of fascism 80 years ago likewise didn't know if they would win. We often forget that there was a good chunk of the war's early years during which the outcome was far from certain, and yet that generation rallied regardless, and in the process they surprised themselves by what they were capable of achieving. And I think that's the spirit that we need today. And with that, Christine, I'm happy to talk more about the book with you.
Great, thanks so much, Seth. I have questions, and then we'll look to see what's happening in the chat. I see at least one is coming in. I know we want people to buy the books. We don't want to give too much away, but I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit, maybe give us a few of the steps in your battle plan. So what are the highest priority steps in that plan?
Well, the first thing that we have to do is actually adopt an emergency mindset. And we've all had a little flavor of what that looks and feels and sounds like in this COVID experience. You know, the throne speech yesterday was an example of, okay, this government gets emergency with respect to COVID, but they have not yet applied it with respect to the climate emergency. And then, you know, amazing things become possible, as we've seen these last few months, once we adopt an emergency mindset. But one important thing that happens is you move from voluntary to mandatory actions. When I show you that chart and you see so little action so little progress over 20 years, why is that? Almost all of the climate policies we've seen for the last 20 years, federally and provincially, are voluntary. We encourage change, we incentivize change, we give rebates, we send price signals. But we don't do is require. And that's what you do in an emergency. You actually set clear dates and require that certain things happen by a certain time. So you would say, for example, as of 2025, you won't be able to buy a fossil fuel vehicle. As of next year, new buildings won't be able to tie into natural gas for heating, and you drive the change. So that's one piece of it. Another piece of it, and we've seen it in COVID, is you spend what it takes to win. That's what they did in the war. And thankfully, you know, we heard in the throne speech yesterday, now is not the time for austerity. Quite right. And yet we've been hamstrung by austerity thinking when it comes to the climate emergency for decades. And so an emergency frame means liberating ourselves from that. And importantly, I'll end with this, when you're serious about it, you create new economic institutions to get the job done. So, you know, famously in the Second World War, the minister in the King government who oversaw all this military production was this guy, C.D. Howe. Now, most of us who know his name today know it because there's this right-wing think tank in Toronto named for the guy. And he was no lefty, by the way. But he was seized with the task of military production during the war. And he was happy to give contracts to the private sector, but if they couldn't move quickly enough, he created a new crown corporation to get the job done. He created 28 crown corporations in the course of the war. In contrast, Justin Trudeau has created 2 new crown corporations, one of which, as some of you may realize already, is the one that makes us all proud owners of a 60-year-old leaky oil pipeline. It's the Trans Mountain Pipeline Corporation. But there's a study in contrast around emergency is the difference between those two approaches.
Great, thank you. There is a question that I know you as a policy wonk can answer, and it is about fiscal and monetary advice. So could you answer that, Seth? What would you say to Mark Carney? So what fiscal and monetary advice is provided in the book? What would you say to Mark Carney? What would you say to anybody
or
about
to the bank? Well, so let me again come back. So first of all, appreciate for a moment that I wrote my whole book before the pandemic. I had actually sent the book off 3 days before the pandemic was declared. And now we have all seen something extraordinary. And in particular, we've seen something extraordinary on the fiscal and monetary side. The federal government is going to have a deficit this year of, about $350 billion. And amazingly, almost all that new debt has been taken on by the Bank of Canada. The Bank of Canada has assumed a role in this crisis that we have not seen them assume since the Second World War. And so the interest rates are extremely low, but we're paying them to our own federal crown corporation, to ourselves. And really the cat's out of the bag. They have shown what was possible. All these years where we're told we can't spend money on homelessness, we can't spend money on the climate emergency, the money's not there. Now they have shown what was possible all along. So a big piece of it is you just spend. And by the way, this year, the federal debt to GDP ratio with COVID will rise to about 50%. It still doesn't hold a candle to what they did in the Second World War. At the end of the Second World War, the debt to GDP ratio was 108%. So just to give you a sense of what's possible. But they also increased taxes, and we should do that too. You know, we've all watched in the news the last little while that in the midst of the pandemic, there's been incredible profiteering by some corporations making a killing. And as people hopefully saw from the CCPA last week, the 20 richest Canadians have seen an increase in their combined wealth of $37 billion since the start of the pandemic. In the Second World War, that kind of profiteering was illegal. It was an excess profits tax that forbade it. That's why we need another wealth tax as part of how we pay for these things today. So there's a couple examples of where I think we can go.
Thanks, Seth. Now we have a few questions coming in. I'm trying to, we don't have too much time. Perhaps I'll go with, so how do we then, as a country, approach emission reduction? So how do we approach low emission energy usage? The second question, but related, is how do we vote or work towards it? But so what's that look like?
Yeah, well, two somewhat different questions.
Yes.
I think on the first one, I'm trying to give a bit of a hint. So one piece of it is we would spend. I think we actually need to invest something in the order of 100 billion a year for the next number of years in order to expedite this kind of change. But it's not just about spending, it's also about those new economic institutions. So I mentioned to you how C.D. Howe had created 28 crown corporations during the war. One of the fun exercises in the book was to say, okay, well, what would those new generation crown corporations be to get the job done? And how would we approach it in a similar way? So Howe began it by taking an inventory of what do we need and what production capacity do we have, and where there's a gap, he filled the gap, often with these crown corporations. I think we need to do the same thing today. We need to say, how many electric buses do we need? How many electric heat pumps do we need? How many solar arrays do we need? How many wind turbine farms do we need? And then you see if the production is there, and if it isn't, we do it. We don't try to incentivize it or just encourage, we actually do it ourselves. A bunch of those can be done as crown utilities or as new crown corporations. I just went through the process this year of getting all the natural gas out of my own home and switching to electric heat pump. It was challenging, it was expensive, And it was more expensive than it needed to be. I came out of that experience and thinking, what if there was a corporation that mass produced electric heat pumps and had an army of installers who came and made it easy for you? And through those economies of scale and getting rid of the profit margin, they could shave thousands of dollars off the cost of actually doing that. So that's a piece of it. But the other piece of all of this is the link to inequality around how you actually get the public on board. Maybe that's a segue to the second part of your question. Obviously, we need to elect people who are true climate champions across different political parties. I conducted some original polling as part of my book research, and the good news out of that polling is that the public is actually ahead of our politics in terms of their willingness to embrace bold climate policies. They're there, they're ready. But interestingly, when you ask people, well, what do you think about something like the Green New Deal, or getting at this through increasing transfers to lower income people, or offering a good jobs guarantee to fossil fuel workers, or increasing taxes on the wealthy and corporations, when you link it to the battle to confront inequality, the support for that bold climate action doesn't go down, it goes through the roof. I mean, and that's another lesson from the Second World War, is that when you invite the public not just to, rally to the immediate task at hand, but you make a promise about the different kind of society that's going to come out the other end, that's when you get everyone on the bus.
Great. I mean, I think perhaps this question is digging a little bit deeper into that, and I know you address this in the book. So why aren't our political leaders moving on this? Our country's quite divided is the question. How could we address this political stalemate and keep Canada together? So what are the barriers to actually moving this forward? And yeah.
So in terms of, why aren't our politicians moving faster? One piece of that is that the curse of the climate crisis, unlike COVID and unlike the war, is that it moves in slower motion. And that has slowed things down. Secondly, I think in contrast to the poll results that I just shared with you, I interviewed many politicians and political insiders as part of the book's research. And I only was interested in interviewing people who claimed to get it, who claimed to understand the climate crisis, and yet whose governments were not actually adopting policies aligned with the science. And you press them on these points, and in one way or another, they fall back on some variation on the line of, well, you have to meet the public where they're at, and the public's not there yet, which is one of the motivations I had for commissioning this poll, is I wanted to test if that was true. And I found it to be untrue. I found it that the politicians hadn't given the public enough credit in terms of their willingness for bold action. I also think we haven't seen action because our politicians across the political spectrum, even when new democratic governments have been elected in Alberta or here in British Columbia, they all remain in a straitjacket around these neoliberal economic assumptions that they make. These assumptions that are like zombies, they die hard. And so when you ask, well, why aren't they spending what they need to spend? Why aren't they creating new crown corporations? Why aren't they just using the regulatory power of the state to drive change? The answer is because they accept all of these neoliberal assumptions about what is and isn't allowed until the moment that they don't. I mean, that's the remarkable thing about COVID, right? Is all of those assumptions have been thrown out the window once the government recognizes an emergency. And that's what happened in the Second World War. The Great Depression in Canada was needlessly harsh and brutal and long because the Mackenzie King could not get out of that straitjacket. And so we never had a New Deal in Canada like they had in the States. The war was our New Deal. That was the emergency moment where they could break out of that kind of thinking. But you also asked, because one of the other barriers to change is Confederation itself. And the challenge, we live in a very decentralized federation, for better or for worse. And while overall as a country, we are not highly dependent economically on fossil fuel extraction, certain parts of the country are. Alberta is, Saskatchewan is, Newfoundland is. And that is a barrier to some political action. And it's one I spend a chunk of time on in the book. So let me take Alberta as one example, because 38% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions are from Alberta. Now that means Alberta, we can't get to a solution without Alberta. And it also means recognizing that they have a lot of heavy lifting to do. And the sources of economic anxiety there are perfectly understandable. And it really means that we have to make a real and audacious offer to the people of Alberta and Saskatchewan and Newfoundland. So I propose in the book a new federal transfer. I would call it a climate emergency just transition transfer. But unlike most federal transfer programs where we allocate the money based on population, we would allocate it based on greenhouse gas emissions. So if Alberta produces 38% of our emissions, they get 38% of the money. But we wouldn't send it to Jason Kenney because he's not to be trusted on this. We would create new just transition agencies in every province, jointly governed by the feds and municipalities and First Nations and other climate experts. And it would be big, so that instead of just transition being a hollow promise for a lot of people, they could see the money on the table and know that transition support is real.
Thanks so much, Seth. There are other questions, but I think what we'll do now is perhaps move to the panel. We do have another Q&A, so we may have opportunities to get back to some of these questions, and there may be new ones, and we'll try and figure that out. But thank you so much, Seth. That was, I mean, people will want to now read more about what you have to say, what your plan is as we move forward. But thanks, Seth. We have asked each of our panelists to take 5 minutes to share their thoughts on what the next stage of climate mobilization, environmental protection in our province should look like. And then we will have a discussion. So we'll ask again to save your questions until after all the panelists have spoken, and we'll once again look at the chat box. So first up for our panel is Dorian Bernard. Thank you, Dorene, for welcoming us today. Dorene is a Mi'kmaq elder of the Shubenacadie band. She resides in Indian Brook, Nova Scotia. She's a grassroots grandmother, water protector, water walker, and social justice activist. She is a survivor of the Shubenacadie Indian Residential School. She had a 20-year career in social work and earned a Master of Social Work in Aboriginal Field of Study at Sir Wilfrid Laurier University in 2013. She worked at the Mi'kmaq Debert to develop the Indian Residential School Legacy Project and continues to work for survivors of the commemoration of the Shubenacadie Indian Residential School. She was appointed to the Coady Chair on Social Justice at St. FX in 2017 and focused her work on education on Indigenous issues, environmental racism, and climate justice. She is the mother of 4, the proud grandmother of 9, and they all inspire her to do the work that she does to ensure a positive future for them and their future generations. Over to you, Dorene.
There's a lot. There's a lot to talk about in 5 minutes, but I know one of the things that we have been working on is to address the environmental racism in Nova Scotia, and our fight to protect our lands and our waters, our responsibilities, our inherent rights and responsibilities to protect our land. And we are currently still before the courts with the Alton Gas project that is infrastructure for frack gas for export, and it's a much bigger project than just protecting the river where we are. But as we see, they talk about transitioning away from fossil fuels and what our future is going to be, and then yet we see these corporations coming in 14 years after the fact. We're 14 years into consultation. We're just getting consultation done now. Actually, it's a court-ordered consultation because it didn't take place, and at the beginning of this project, had we known about it, the Mi'kmaq would have been able to stop the development of this project to where it is right now, and destruction to the river and to the land, and actually the future project of LNG and pipelines coming up from the United States from the Massachusetts. There was a lot of parts of this project that is in big chunks that we've seen coming together, and we call it the snake. This is the head of the snake, you know, where they're going to put this frack gas, and if they don't build this, then they will need for pipeline or LNG terminal, and we weren't involved in the consultation of this project. And had it been done, I would say we would have been on the front line in 2007. We didn't know about it until 2014, and we've been in the court system with this project for 5 years, trying to just to get our treaty rights acknowledged, our title to our lands and our water, and what happens here on our territory. And we had to go to court, just like when we were fighting for our fishing rights, you know. And we won Supreme Court challenges on fishing and hunting, and here we are. We're still fighting for those rights, to implement those the rights that we have, and our title to our lands, and this is unceded Mi'kmaq. You know, it's very important that people get that education, because that has been our Mi'kmaq education. Our Indigenous histories throughout Canada have been left out of the history books, and that's the government's policy to erase our culture, you know, assimilation, to erase our culture, our history, language. You know, as survivor of residential school, we still are impacted by the losses of our culture and our language and our abilities to practice our ways. And as we learn those things and heal from those losses, and we embrace those teachings that have helped us to honor our lands, honor our relationship to the land and water and all life that sustains us, but also that the Mother Earth sustains. So we are at a time right now, and there's so many things going on. It's just one fight after another, where we're working on trying to get the government and the corporations to consult with us on the use of our lands and waters, and how and we are also another corporation is coming in to make waste, toxic waste, store toxic waste in a pristine lake where they're mining for gold. And we have not been, as Indigenous people, we have not been consulted about these things, and how it is the women's responsibility to stand and protect the water and protect our land for our future generations. It is us that are put on the front line. It is our responsibility as life givers to protect the water, and to stand up be that voice for those that don't have a voice, our grandchildren and even our future children that are becoming into this world, but also all life, where we are connected to the flyers and the swimmers and the crawlers and the plants and everything in creation. So it's our responsibility, and have we all worked together as treaty people, you know, as signatories to our treaties, that that we are sharing this land. This is our land. This is our water. This is for your future generations too. And what are we leaving behind for them? And it's very important in this last, I guess, decade of educating people about who we are, about our responsibilities together, and developing a connection, you know, like I guess a relationship with their land and their surroundings and their environment. And more and more people have come to feel that. And I know COVID has really brought that forward for a lot of people, where they went out on the land and they found healing at the water and in the woods, and they spent more time, I think, connecting to what is really important, you know, for them and their families. And nature is, you know, the world around them, their environment became very, I mean, front and center for them to know that this is, you know, part of their life. And now that they're not just running out the door and working and coming back and trying to do things, I think that they had that time to look at what's important, what they really need, and less waste and less I think spending on things that, you know, that they didn't need, and more on spending time together and spending time on the land. So I think it's really important that that those lessons have been learned, and people are coming together to realize, you know, climate change is impacting us all, whether you're rich or poor, whether you're whatever your circumstances are. Someone is still being impacted by what is happening in the world, and we can see what's happening here in Mi'kma'ki, where we are, you know, on the front lines to protect the environment, our lands, and our rights as Indigenous people. Yes, so I think it is our Indigenous sovereignty and our right to self-government, you know, to govern ourselves, how we manage our lands, our resources. It is up to us to have that ability, and to assert that ability. And we ask for all that, all the people to support us in doing that.
Oh, thank you so much, Dorene, not just for your words tonight, but for being a water protector, for all that you are doing to protect our water and our land, for what you've contributed every day. And I can't thank you enough. And giving us some roadmap to what we need to do in order to mobilize. We need that treaty education. We need to act as all treaty people. We need to stand in solidarity. We need to support. We need to fight on all those fronts. So I thank you so much for your words tonight.
Yes, and I'm sure let you know, it's not only me, it's many
right.
grandmothers, yes, and people, and people that are doing this together. Yes.
Thank you. I'm going to introduce our second panelist. Louise Delisle is with the South End Environmental Justice Society. She has organized for a provincial environmental bill of rights, for cleaning up of the Shelburne town dump, and for Black residents of Shelburne to have safe drinking water. Delisle Louise is the eldest of a family of 7 children. She was born and raised in Shelburne, Nova Scotia. She attended Shelburne Regional High, where she made some of her lifelong friends and later pursued a nursing career. She is the founder and president of the Black Pioneers acting troupe. Louise has been writing plays for the Black Pioneers for a number of years. Louise was featured in the environmental racism documentary, Something in the Water. I'll hand it to you, Louise.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you for having me, and thank you, Seth, for writing the book. I feel like I'm living in a science fiction movie when you talk to me about climate change, because I'm sure that many people my own age feel the same way. It's a bit overwhelming, the whole concept of climate change. And we needed something to explain it to us, and I think Seth's book will help me, and I hope it'll help other people. When I talk about environmental racism, it's easy. It's easy because I lived it. And it should be easy as well to speak about climate change. When we talk about environmental racism, I think about clean water comes to mind first, which is something that is lacking in our community. Because of environmental racism, our wells are contaminated to the point we can't drink the water. While clean water is available for cost, low-income communities and Black communities live in areas more likely to have unsafe drinking water and high rates of pollution. With the climate changing, the wells in our community are becoming dry and staying dry longer. They're going dry earlier in the year and staying dry, so we end up with no water in our community. Climate change plus harmful environment policies and racism connect us all in our community. I believe that this is why we all must stand together to fight against these things. We must act today. We could reach temperatures of dangerous degrees by 2050. This is what the scientists are saying. And to a point of, it will come to a point of no return, which comes to which is caused by the devastating impact of climate change. At the same time, if we do not change the policies that put the least powerful communities in positions where we are most vulnerable to environmental disasters and climate change, we'll ensure a future in which only the elite survive. That's how it's going to be if these things are not corrected. Together, we must change the world to save it. And we have to do that together. We can't do that alone. I read that somewhere and it stayed with me throughout my life. We can't build a world that is comfortable and lasting for us all with all the unjust and hospitality that we have in society today. We can't come together that way. We need to coordinate all human activities to achieve this goal of saving our world. We have to. And there are people right in this panel that know how to do that. Like the Native people are the strongest people and know Mother Earth and can teach everybody how to do that. So we need to start with elimination of racism. So we listen to people, and environmental injustice, and then climate change will come. It'll change. Environmental racism is linked to climate change because it dictates who benefits from activities that produce planet warming gases and who suffers most from the consequences. It's the Black community, the Native community, the poor people. In my community, we have not only been exposed to poor drinking water, but we've also been exposed to poor air from the burning of the dump. Well, when the heat from climate change happens, the pollution and the illnesses will also happen. So more people will die from heat-related diseases. It's a very scary time we're living in. We need to work together to have training in green jobs and information on climate change, environmental racism, education on what people have been exposed to and what they need to do now to stay healthy. And we need to be part of the decision, the discussions, and the jobs that will address climate change. We can't afford to not care about climate change. When you're a part of a marginalized community, we can't solve a problem we're afraid of looking at. We have to look at it and work at it together. That's my input on that. And I'm looking forward to reading Seth's book.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Louise. So much for us to think about as we seek that solidarity that you're talking about. And thank you so much for caring so much, for doing all that you have done and continue to do. I know, Seth's book and work is very much about centering climate justice. And I think we'll be hearing more about that from our next panelist as well. So I'd like to introduce her. Thank you, Louise.
Thank you.
Tina Yeonju Oh is a Korean immigrant that grew up in Amiskwakiwaskahikin, Edmonton, Alberta, where it took her family over 13 years to gain permanent residency status. She is a grad student at Dalhousie, a migrant and climate justice organizer for No One is Illegal Halifax, and a former member of the Canadian Youth Delegation to 3 United Nations climate change conferences aimed at holding the government, the federal government in particular, accountable to climate justice. Tina was featured by the CBC as 13 Canadian environmentalists and innovators changing Earth for the better, and named Canada's top 25 environmentalists under 25 by Starfish Canada. Over to you, Tina.
Thank you so much. You folks can hear me okay? Okay,
perfect.
I'm super deeply grateful to share space virtually with you all. I'm feeling a little starstruck to be on the panel with Louise, Delisle, and of course, grandmother Dorene. It's also great to be in space with people that care about the state of the world today, the world that we're going to be leaving behind for future generations. I'll start off by saying that I'm tuning in from Jabukduk, so-called Halifax. I'm a climate and migrant justice organizer with No One is Illegal. I'd like to maybe share some thoughts today about where climate and migrant justice converge and are inherently intertwined together. But before I do that, we need to call attention to 2 very important contexts happening on these lands in Mi'kma'ki today. And as grandmother Dorene has mentioned, the confrontations happening in Saulnierville. For decades, Mi'kmaq fishers and Mi'kmaq have faced immense racism and attacks to their treaty rights to fish, to food sovereignty, to feed their communities. Meanwhile, corporations like Clearwater continue to extract millions in profit, willfully break conservation regulations, and cause havoc to the waters and land. Mi'kmaq water protectors, warriors, land defenders have time and time again put their bodies on the front lines to assert and defend their rights to protect the land and water. So to answer the question really simply, the next phase of climate emergency mobilization looks like devoted, committed solidarity with Indigenous-led resistance. Indigenous people are and have been the stewards of the land and water for millennia. To demand climate justice on these lands is to be in solidarity with Mi'kmaq-led resistance against oil and gas, against the Sisson Brook mine, against fracking and offshore drilling. And it is to understand that as a non-Indigenous person living in Mi'kma'ki as a Korean migrant, the Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral, unceded, unsurrendered, and future territory of the Mi'kmaq, I have a responsibility to learn, to take leadership, to struggle in solidarity with Indigenous-led resistance. And I'm going to come back to this, but I want to switch gears to also what happened on Tuesday when we were hit by Hurricane Teddy. Where I'm based in Halifax, we weren't hit too badly, but I know that over 13,000 people lost power across the province. And that's potentially about 13,000 homes and families that lost hundreds of dollars in their freezers. We're being told that this is one of the worst predicted hurricane seasons in years. And while there's also a housing crisis happening in Halifax that's displaced thousands of people's, thousands of members of our community onto the streets. And it's just one of the many ways in which that the climate crisis disproportionately impacts the poorest and most vulnerable among us. It is impossible to imagine and to build and to mobilize towards a just, livable world without understanding where these injustices originate from. And as those on the front lines tell us, as Louise and as grandmother Dorene have mentioned, the roots of these entangled, overlapping crises lies in ongoing colonization, in imperialism, in capitalism, and extractivist forces. They are the same forces that create war and poverty, that displaces and dispossesses Black, Indigenous, racialized communities across the world. Friends, migration is an inevitable outcome of colonization, of war, of poverty, and the climate crisis. Every 6 seconds, a person is being displaced from their home and community due to a climate-related disaster. And that's why it's not a secret that the same politicians that delay climate action, that deny climate science, are the same politicians that drum up anti-immigrant scapegoating. It is no coincidence that as this climate crisis worsens, governments like ours respond by fortressing its borders. Today, we're in a state of multiple nationwide crises: a climate crisis, the COVID crisis, a crisis of affordable housing, a crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit people, an opioid crisis that took 3,000 lives last year alone, a crisis of deep-seated racism against Indigenous people, against African Nova Scotian people and Black people, and against migrants. And in this moment of crisis, where the only rational thing to do is to prioritize a just recovery and transition into decarbonizing our society, we have to ask, what side are our politicians and governments on? And I think that's the root of what Seth's book gets to too. Governments continue to give billions of dollars, millions of dollars to the wealthiest corporations like Clearwater through tax breaks, while we're told that there's no room for refugees, no room for free public transit, no money for our children's educations. But we know that all these issues are connected, that migrant justice means upholding Indigenous sovereignty, it means uniting against racism, and it means addressing the climate crisis. The next phase of climate mobilization on these lands is to build a movement that dismantles all forms of hatred. It opens the borders to those seeking asylum and refuge and understands that all of our struggles are connected. Our role now is to stand in solidarity with Mi'kmaq, with African Nova Scotians on the front lines of these overlapping crises. And this is how we win. We win by breaking down the silos of our collective struggles and by using them to build empathy, to forge relationships and solidarity amongst each other. And that's where I'll end it there.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you, Tina. That was powerful. Wow, what an incredible panel we've had this evening. Just a reminder that you can ask questions in the chat. We do have a bit of time for a few more questions. I was going to scroll up and see if perhaps I'll go to a question that was asked earlier and build on what Tina has asked us to talk about, and that is this mobilization. So let me just find this question here. I totally agree with the need for the government to focus strongly on this and the emergency mindset, but would be really interested to hear what you think could be done to strengthen action and bring this movement forward at the level needed at the local community scale. So the example given was Victory Gardens, but if any of you want to jump in, are there other things that you would talk about to really strengthen at the level of local community as we seek to mobilize? And anybody can jump in.
Well, that's what we're doing today at the Saulnier Wharf, and to keep our people safe and to support the treaty fishery, moderate livelihood fishery. We have children down there. I have a child down there. I have you know, many relatives that are there, and to bring people down to be witness to what is happening there, and also to bring support, you know, as a support to for the people that are there to assert our rights. I think it's very important that that all Nova Scotians and Canadians understand what is happening, and it's not just the treaty right to fish. It's a treaty right to hunt, to fish, to sustain ourselves off our lands and waters, and to protect these resources for everyone, for all our next 7 generations. We always look at what 7 generations in front of us, and people can come down to be a part of that, learn more about what is happening firsthand. I think all the misinformation and all the things that are out there, I think when they come down and they actually speak and see for themselves and actually speak to the people that are there, there's a better understanding. Not everyone is against us. There's many people there, non-native people there, that are supporting us as well, and even coming in and asking questions, you know, because they weren't informed. This is not their education that they received, you know, about the Mi'kmaq treaties, and about even the cases that have already been through the courts, and what this means for what it means to be a treaty person, you know, together. And so I think that's part of it, but we're also educating them about our relationship to the land and the water, and I think in ceremony, we have ceremonies there as well to help people to feel that and to understand that, and I think that's helping to as well to open up that dialogue and communication and extend our hands in friendship. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Doreen. Does anybody else want to jump in there? One of the other questions that has come up, and I think it speaks to some of what Tina was raising, is, you know, things are a little different than they were back during World War II. Our world is, well, we call it globalization. You know, there's more economic codependence. We have different trade rules and regime, and you know, I wonder about that in terms of our ability to tackle the climate emergency.
Yeah, maybe I can jump in here. So I love this question. I saw it in the chat, so I was thinking about it for a little bit. My entry into climate justice organizing actually came through community gardening. So community gardening, when you said Victory Gardens, it made me think about that relation to community gardening. I think it's so vital that, you know, the tensions that's happening in Saulnierville, that is actually an issue of food sovereignty, that is an attempt of food apartheid. And community gardens at the local level, Victory Gardens, like that was mentioned, is a way of understanding that, you know, we are part of this global schema of transnational labor, where, you know, Latin American farmers are on our side of the border with precarious immigration status, sometimes with no immigration status, that puts them at risk to horrendous conditions and violations against their human rights. And yet we have to also think about the ways in which, how are we feeding our communities? And I think that was a great suggestion. That was, I think anyway, that's a role in which there's great possibility there. Community gardening and strengthening our local food sovereignty. And of course, Christine, like you mentioned, we live in a globalized world or a globalizing world. Every day, we're more and more connected to one another. And even though the focus of action, in my opinion, where change really does happen at the bottom up level in the community, we have to also, I guess rather, we can never forget that we are connected to this global world and that our actions here impact millions of people elsewhere. And so, you know, the saying of act locally, think globally, I know that's cheesy, but it's absolutely true. And understanding that the ways in which even our foodways are connected to this global sphere is also really important because we can't do this on our own. We can't see this in a silo. Whether that's, for local change, and leave it there.
Fantastic, thank you for making those connections. Anybody else want to jump in on those questions, or the local to the global?
I'll just, what I was thinking was about the economic foundation of the Industrial Revolution. It was slavery, you know, since slavery created that. And government really hasn't stepped up to help it with modern day policies. Like, you know, we're still dealing with many influences from that period. And the Native people as well. Like, you know, when we have to convince people that our environment and our resources and whatever are part of the global warming effect as well, and that we're being discriminated against because we're not being helped to in our environment and show ways to not be exposed to different things. We need to have government step forward and tell us, you know, what's happening, what's really happening with climate change, and how is it affecting our communities. And we need to know these things. I don't know if that was relevant, but it felt like it was to me at the time.
Absolutely relevant. Yes, thank you, Louise. I'm actually going to ask Seth if, I mean, you can address any of the questions, but I also want to give you an opportunity to have some closing remarks, as we're going to respect everybody's time, and it's 8:24. This has been amazing, but I'm going to hand it over to you, Seth.
Sure, thank you, and thank you. That was a really rich panel. Doreen, Louise, and Tina, I really admire all of the work that all of you do. And thanks so much for doing this. Maybe just to make a few observations to Doreen's point, acting in solidarity with the assertion of Indigenous treaty rights and title, as I said at the outset, is core to winning. In the book, I try to survey all of these instances across the country where, you know, in the face of mainstream politics that continues to dither and dodge on a coherent climate plan, over and over and over again, it is the assertion of those Indigenous treaty rights that is buying us time and stopping and stalling these fossil fuel projects. And, you know, I said early on in my talk about the new climate denialism. In the book, I talk about how rights and title denialism is really its close cousin, and the two operate hand in glove, and they particularly operate hand in glove in the face of the desire of fossil fuel companies to do what they do. And, you know, Louise, thank you for that reminder about that history of environmental racism. In my book and in my talk earlier, I kind of laud the story of these crown corporations that were created in World War II. But I also then later on highlight this reality that a bunch of those very same corporations left a toxic legacy on Indigenous territories all over the country. And so this time we have to do it right. And your reminder is that this fossil fuel extraction and this industrial development only is possible because of sacrifice zones and expendable people and expendable lands. And it's only racism that allows the general public to abide that. Otherwise, it wouldn't function. And Tina, thank you for your work with No One is Illegal and for highlighting the climate migrant piece in all of this, which I also speak to in the book. And your parents' story is such a contrast with my parents' story. So first of all, I mentioned off the top, my parents came when they were pregnant with me in the late 1960s. And that was sort of a historic anomaly in terms of how easy it was then. They were advised to come to Montreal late at night, where they would be likely to find, when they were coming as Vietnam draft dodgers, and to fly in at night where they would encounter a Francophone customs agent, and they were almost all against the war. And sure enough, they got landed immigrant status in 20 minutes at the airport and a kiss on both cheeks. Now, in contrast, an earlier generation of Jewish refugees during the war, of which I write, encountered a slammed door. Like, that is one of the most shameful legacies of Canada's Second World War experience, was the treatment of refugees. And I mentioned in the book that I remember some years ago hearing a speech. Many of you have probably heard over the years, probably more than once, the amazing Indigenous child advocate Cindy Blackstock. And she was giving a speech where she offered this definition of reconciliation that always stuck with me. Very simple. And it was just this: reconciliation means not having to say you're sorry twice, which is to say, we learn. And for me, recounting that history of what happened in World War II in response to refugees, and then you bring in what Tina talked about, where the global climate migration crises, I think, are going to be one of the defining stories of the next 50 years. And we're going to have to decide as a country, are we going to see a repeat of that same story we more often than not have seen? Or are we going to act differently this time? I just want to say in closing that, the student mobilizations that we saw before the pandemic and these Indigenous land defenses and the solidarity actions in support of them, they've been incredible. And they have shifted the political landscape in our country pre-pandemic. All of that has lost a little momentum because of the pandemic, but I think part of our challenge now is to recapture that. I think we can, because the flip side of the pandemic experience is that we come out of it with a sense of social solidarity and national unity that we actually haven't seen in a generation. A new appreciation for the role of government and public services, a new appreciation for science and the role of scientists, and as Dorene was saying, also a new appreciation of nature. All of which actually situates us well for this next task, I think, of rising to the climate emergency. It is an emergency. Emergencies, as we've all experienced in this pandemic, need to look and sound and feel like emergencies. And so, my closing message to all of you is that we need to make the most of this minority government moment federally, this pandemic moment and the recovery, this emergency moment, to sound the alarm however we can. Now is the time to demand both our federal and provincial governments adopt true climate emergency plans and an audacious Green New Deal. And I think we can do so knowing, both from that wartime experience I write about and now from our pandemic experience, that when we adopt an emergency mindset, the scale and speed of what we can do can be spectacular. And so that's what I would invite people to commit to tonight as we all take action on this task of our lives. I note at the conclusion of the book that few of us on this webinar tonight were alive in World War II. maybe a few, but few of us. But a lot of us, particularly those of us with a sort of nerdy interest in history, you know, we look back on pivotal times like that and we ask ourselves, what would I have done if I had lived then and there? But the answer to that is really no mystery at all. The answer to that is whatever we're all ready to do now. And I could see in the chat that people were raising questions about, you know, this task feels so big and there's so many political obstacles. In World War II, 1 million Canadians enlisted out of a population of 11 million. And more than 1 million were involved in military production. And we trained all those people up and we reintegrated them back into peacetime. That's all far more people than are engaged in the fossil fuel industry today. If we could do that then, we can do it again. And well, maybe to quote Joel's song, where there's a will, there's a way.
Perfect. Thank you, Seth. And truly, thank you for writing this inspiring book. Thank you, merci, Liliak, to everyone who has joined us tonight. Thank you to everyone who asked a question. There's lots of information being shared in the chat, so please do look there. Lilian, to Mi'kmaq Elder Dorian Bernard for welcoming us. Thank you, Louise and Tina, for sharing your wisdom, your experience, your ideas with us. Thank you, Joel, for sharing your talent. And Sherry for tuning in again from BC. Thank you to our co-sponsors and partners. We have provided links in there, and please do think about supporting the organizations like mine and others who are working to ensure that we do tackle this climate emergency and center justice in the plans as we move forward. You can stay up to date on what's happening provincially by, for example, checking out what's happening through the Ecology Action Center. And in solidarity, I do want to mention two things. So tomorrow is a climate strike. The school strike for Halifax has organized a climate strike for tomorrow. You are to arrive by 12:30 in Halifax at City Hall. So please do show solidarity with our youth who, as Seth said, have been leading for us. There's also a solidarity rally on Saturday, and this is in support of the Mi'kmaq who are asserting their treaty rights. The solidarity rally is at 11 near the Big Wave on the Halifax waterfront. Thanks again, everyone. Be well, stay safe, organize.